Cristiano, we shouldn't have taken that shortcut, Messi whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. The ancient forest loomed around them like a living nightmare, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the fading twilight. They had been walking for hours, but the path seemed to lead nowhere except deeper into darkness. Ronaldo's jaw tightened as he pushed through the thick undergrowth. Listen, Leo, I've never backed down from a challenge, and I'm not starting now. His Portuguese accent cut through the airy silence like a blade, but even the legendary CR7 couldn't hide the tremor in his voice as something howled in the distance. The sound was unlike anything they'd ever heard, a bone-chilling wail that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. Messi's hand instinctively reached for Ronaldo's arm. What was that? He gasped, his Argentine accent thick with fear. The forest had gone completely silent, as if every creature was holding its breath. I don't know, but we need to keep moving, Ronaldo replied, though his usual confidence was cracking. The GPS on his phone had died hours ago, and the compass was spinning wildly. They were truly lost in this godforsaken wilderness. The trees seemed to be watching them, their bark twisted into grotesque faces. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind them. Both men spun around, hearts pounding like drums in their chests. Did you hear that? Messi's eyes darted frantically through the shadows. The darkness was so thick it seemed solid, impenetrable. Something was definitely following them, staying just out of sight. We're being hunted, Ronaldo said grimly, his athlete's instincts kicking in. Whatever it is, it's been tracking us for the last mile. His muscles tensed, ready to fight or flee. The forest floor was littered with bones, animal bones, he hoped, but some looked disturbingly human-like in the moonlight. Messi's breathing became rapid and shallow. Cristiano, look at these trees. They're not normal. The bark was oozing a dark, viscous substance that smelled like rotting flesh. The leaves were an unnatural shade of black, and they seemed to whisper secrets in a language neither man could understand. A low growl echoed through the forest, closer this time, much closer. Ronaldo grabbed Messi's shoulder. Run. Now, they sprinted through the undergrowth, branches tearing at their clothes and skin. Behind them, something massive was crashing through the trees, gaining ground with every second. This way, Messi shouted, pointing to what looked like a narrow path between two enormous oak trees. They dove through the gap just as razor-sharp claws raked the air where they'd been standing. The creature's roar of frustration shook the very ground beneath their feet. They tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling over rocks and roots until they crashed into a small clearing. Ronaldo was the first to stand, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Are you hurt? He asked, helping Messi to his feet. The Argentine was limping, but his eyes were alert and determined. I'll live, Messi panted, wiping dirt from his face. But what the hell was that thing? The clearing was eerily quiet, surrounded by a circle of dead trees that looked like they'd been burned from the inside out. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Ronaldo approached the altar cautiously. These markings, they're not from any language I know. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. A cold wind began to blow, carrying with it the stench of decay, and something far worse, the smell of pure evil. Don't touch it, Messi warned, but it was too late. Ronaldo's fingers had already brushed against the stone surface. The moment his skin made contact, the symbols began to glow with a sickly green light. The temperature plummeted, and their breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. The ground beneath their feet started to tremble. Cracks appeared in the earth, spreading outward from the altar like a spider's web. From these fissures came a sound that made their blood freeze, the sound of something ancient and hungry stirring to life after centuries of slumber. We need to get out of here, Messi yelled over the increasing rumble. The dead trees around them began to move, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. The altar was now pulsing with malevolent energy, and the symbols were burning brighter with each passing second. Ronaldo grabbed Messi's hand and they ran toward the edge of the clearing. But the trees had formed a living wall, their branches intertwining to block every exit. They were trapped in a prison of twisted wood and malevolent magic. The creature that had been hunting them earlier was nothing compared to this. There, Messi pointed to a gap between two trees that was slowly closing. They sprinted toward it, diving through just as the branches snapped shut behind them. The roar of frustration that followed them was like the sound of 1,000 demons screaming in unison. They found themselves on a narrow ledge overlooking a deep ravine. The moon had disappeared behind thick clouds, leaving them in almost complete darkness. Below them, they could hear the sound of rushing water, but it was too far down to see. Behind them, the forest was alive with malevolent energy. We have to jump, Ronaldo said, his voice steady despite the insanity of the situation. It's either that or face whatever's behind us. Messi looked at the drop, then back at the glowing eyes that were now visible between the trees. The choice was clear, even if it meant certain death. On three, Messi agreed. 1, 2, a massive shape burst from the tree line, all claws and fangs and burning red eyes. It was a creature from nightmares, part wolf, part bear, and part something that should never have existed. 3, they shouted in unison and leaped into the void. The fall seemed to last forever. Wind rushed past their ears as they plummeted through the darkness. Ronaldo reached out and grabbed Messi's hand, holding tight as they fell toward the unknown. The sound of the creature's rage echoed off the canyon walls, following them down into the abyss. They hit the water with a tremendous splash, the icy cold shocking their systems. The current was stronger than they'd expected, dragging them downstream at a terrifying pace. Rocks and debris battered their bodies as they struggled to stay afloat in the churning rapids. Stay together, Ronaldo shouted over the roar of the water. They fought against the current, trying to reach the shore, but the river had other plans. It carried them deeper into the forest, toward whatever horrors awaited them in the darkness ahead. Finally, they managed to grab onto a fallen log and pull themselves onto a muddy riverbank. They lay there gasping, soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. The forest around them was different here, older, more twisted, filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Look, Messi whispered, pointing ahead. Through the trees, they could see the flickering light of a fire. It was the first sign of civilization they'd encountered since entering this cursed place. But in a forest like this, fire could mean salvation or something far worse. They approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at them to run. But the cold was seeping into their bones, and they needed warmth or they would die of exposure. The fire was burning in a small clearing, surrounded by what looked like a primitive camp. "Hello," Ronaldo called out softly. "Is anyone there?" No response came, but they could see shapes moving in the shadows beyond the firelight. Whatever was out there was watching them, waiting. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crackling of the flames. They entered the camp, drawn by the promise of warmth. But as they got closer, they realized the truth. The shapes around the fire weren't people, they were scarecrows, dressed in the rotting clothes of previous travelers. And the fire itself was burning something that definitely wasn't wood. "We need to leave now," Messi said, backing away from the fire. But it was too late. The scarecrows were moving, turning their burlap heads toward the two footballers. Their button eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence, and their stitched mouths curved into horrible grins. One of the scarecrows stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. When it spoke, its voice was like rustling leaves mixed with the sound of tearing fabric. "Welcome, travelers. We've been waiting for you. The forest is hungry, and you will feed it well." Ronaldo stepped protectively in front of Messi. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, though his voice betrayed his fear. The scarecrows had tilted at an impossible angle, and its button eye seemed to bore into his soul. "Want?" The scarecrow laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "We want nothing but the forest. The forest requires sacrifice. Every 100 years, it must feed. And you two are perfect." The other scarecrows began to close in, their straw-stuffed arms reaching out. "Run!" Messi shouted, and they bolted from the camp. Behind them, the scarecrows gave chase, their movements becoming more fluid and terrifying with each step. The fire exploded into a column of green flame that lit up the entire forest with its sickly glow. They ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping at their faces and roots trying to trip them. The sound of pursuit was constant, the rustling of straw and the terrible laughter of the scarecrows. Every shadow seemed to hide another horror, every tree a potential trap. Suddenly, Messi stumbled and fell. Ronaldo skidded to a halt, turning back to help his companion. But as he reached down, he saw that Messi's leg was caught in what looked like a bear trap made of twisted roots and thorns. Blood was already seeping through his torn pants. "Leave me," Messi gasped, his face pale with pain. "Save yourself." But Ronaldo was already working to free him, his fingers torn and bleeding from the thorns. The sound of approaching scarecrows was getting closer, their terrible laughter echoing through the trees. With a final, desperate effort, Ronaldo managed to pry the root trap open. Messi's leg was badly damaged, but he could still walk. They stumbled forward together, supporting each other as the nightmare continued around them. The forest itself seemed to be against them now. They burst through a curtain of hanging moss and found themselves in another clearing. But this one was different. It was filled with mirrors, hundreds of them, hanging from the trees like grotesque fruit. Each one showed a different reflection, none of them accurate. Don't look directly at them, Messi warned, remembering old stories his grandmother had told him about cursed mirrors. But it was hard to avoid them when they were everywhere. Some showed them as monsters, others as corpses, and a few showed nothing at all. The scarecrows had stopped at the edge of the clearing, apparently unable or unwilling to enter, but their laughter continued, now joined by new voices, the voices of everyone who had ever been lost in these woods. The mirrors began to sing, a haunting melody that threatened to drive them mad. One mirror showed them a way out, a path that led through the trees to what looked like a road, but as they approached it, the reflection changed, showing them the path led to a cliff that dropped into nothingness. The mirrors were liars, showing them false hope. "We're trapped," Ronaldo said, his voice hollow with despair. The mirrors were closing in, sliding along the trees like living things. Each one showed a different death, a different horror, and behind them, the scarecrows were beginning to venture into the clearing. That's when Messi remembered something his old coach had told him: sometimes the only way out is through. He grabbed Ronaldo's hand and ran straight at the largest mirror. "Trust me," he shouted as they crashed through the glass surface. They tumbled through a world of broken reflections, each shard showing a different moment of their lives. The sound of shattering glass was deafening, and rainbow light fractured around them as they fell through the mirror dimension. Then, suddenly, they were back in the forest. But this part of the forest was different. The trees were normal, the air was fresh, and in the distance, they could see the lights of a small town. They had somehow broken through the curse that had trapped them. The nightmare was over, or so they thought. As they walked toward the lights, they didn't notice the scarecrow that had followed them through the mirror. It stood in the shadows behind them, its button eyes gleaming with malevolent patience. The forest had let them go, but it would remember them, and someday, it would call them back. They reached the town as the sun was rising, their clothes torn, and their bodies battered. The local police found them wandering the streets, babbling about scarecrows and cursed mirrors. No one believed their story, of course. They were just two famous footballers who had gotten lost in the woods. But Ronaldo and Messi knew the truth. They had survived something that should have killed them, something that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. They never spoke of it publicly, but sometimes, in the quiet moments between games, they would look at each other and remember. Years later, when reporters asked about their friendship, they would smile and say it was forged in adversity. They never mentioned the forest, the scarecrows, or the mirrors. But sometimes, on particularly dark nights, they would wake up screaming, remembering the sound of rustling straw and malevolent laughter. And deep in the forest, the scarecrows still wait. The mirrors still sing their haunting songs. The ancient altar still pulses with malevolent energy, because some places exist outside of time and space, waiting for the next travelers foolish enough to take a shortcut through the woods. The forest remembers, and it is always hungry. The official report stated that Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi had been found after being lost for 72 hours in a national forest. They claimed to have no memory of how they had gotten lost or what had happened to them. But those who knew them well noticed the changes: the way they avoided mirrors, their newfound fear of scarecrows, and how they never traveled alone through wooded areas again. Some things are too terrible to remember, and perhaps that's for the best, because in the deepest part of the forest, where the trees grow twisted and the shadows have their own life, the scarecrows still patrol their domain, and they're always looking for new additions to their collection. The forest is patient, the forest is eternal, and the forest never forgets.